Camp Meade, Maryland. The year is 1919. The First World War is over, and the United States Army is rapidly shrinking, dissolving back into a small, underfunded constabulary force. Amidst the rusting equipment and the muddy fields of the demobilizing military, two officers strike up an unlikely friendship. One is loud, wealthy, and flamboyant, a man who wears a golden helmet and believes he is the reincarnation of a Roman legionnaire. The other is quiet, studious, and pragmatic, a Kansan with a bright smile, but a mind like a filing cabinet. They are George S. Patton Jr. and Dwight D. Eisenhower. At this moment in time, they are peers. In fact, in the eyes of many, the flamboyant Patton is a superior officer, the combat veteran with a Distinguished Service Cross. But history has a way of inverting relationships. 2 decades later, the quiet Kansan will hold the fate of the Western world and the career of his loud friend in the palm of his hand. The relationship between Dwight Eisenhower and George Patton is the defining dynamic of the American war effort in Europe. It was a partnership of opposites, a volatile chemical reaction that produced victory but constantly threatened to explode. We often ask why Patton was not given supreme command, but the more interesting historical question is, why did Eisenhower keep him around at all? Why did the Supreme Commander, a man obsessed with coalition unity and diplomatic protocol, protect a general who seemed determined to insult every ally the United States had? The answer lies in a specific, calculated strategy of management, a leash that was tightened and loosened with surgical precision. If you are interested in the psychology of leadership and the complex interpersonal rivalries that shape history just as much as tanks and airplanes, please subscribe to the channel. We are dedicated to exploring the human dimension of the Second World War, going beyond the maps to understand the men who drew them. To understand the leash, we must first understand the depth of the bond formed during the interwar years. At Camp Meade, Eisenhower and Patton were intellectual partners. They were the prophets of a new religion, tank warfare. While the rest of the Army was obsessed with protecting the sanctity of the horse cavalry, these two men were spending their evenings disassembling tank engines and writing theoretical papers on mechanized mobility. They were rebels together. Patton provided the fire and the vision. Eisenhower provided the logic and the logistics. It was here, in the 1920s, that Eisenhower learned exactly how Patton ticked. He saw the genius, yes, but he also saw the instability. He saw a man who would risk his career for a turn of phrase, a man who treated war not as a profession, but as a mystic performance art. As the years passed, their paths diverged. Patton remained with the troops, playing polo, courting controversy, and cultivating his image as a warrior aristocrat. Eisenhower, however, entered the invisible world of the staff officer, under mentorship of General Fox Connor, and later Douglas MacArthur and George Marshall. Eisenhower learned the unglamorous reality of modern warfare. He learned that battles are won by supply chains, by timetables, and, crucially, by politics. He became a master of organization, a desk general, in the most complimentary sense of term. By 1941, the roles had reversed. Eisenhower was being groomed for high command by Washington. Patton was seen by many as a relic, a brilliant but dangerous antique. When Pearl Harbor shattered the peace in December 1941, the dynamic was set in stone. Eisenhower was the architect. Patton was a hammer. Eisenhower knew that he could not win the war without a fighter like Patton. The American Army was green, inexperienced, and terrified. They needed a commander who could instill a killer instinct. But Eisenhower also knew, perhaps better than anyone else, that a hammer sees every problem as a nail. In a coalition war involving the British, the French, and eventually the Soviets, you cannot simply smash everything in your path. You need nuance. Patton had zero nuance. The first test of this new hierarchy came with Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa in November 1942. Eisenhower, now the Supreme Allied Commander, gave Patton command of the Western Task Force aimed at Morocco. It was a massive responsibility. But almost immediately, the headaches began. Before the fleet even sailed, Patton was making incendiary comments about the British and threatening to shoot his own staff if they failed. Eisenhower watched from Gibraltar, his stomach churning with his famous ulcers. He was already managing the massive egos of the British leadership and the treacherous politics of Vichy France. He didn't need a subordinate, causing a diplomatic incident. The leash was loose during the invasion itself. Patton performed brilliantly. He took Casablanca. He strode through the surf with his ivory-handled pistols, looking every bit the conqueror. But once the shooting stopped, the trouble started. Patton, installed as the administrator of Morocco, began to behave like a potentate. He held court. He charmed the Sultan of Morocco, which terrified the French colonial authorities. He made off-the-cuff remarks that rattled the delicate political cage Eisenhower was trying to build. Eisenhower began to realize a fundamental truth. Patton was indispensable in a crisis, but liability in calm waters. Then came Kasserine Pass. In February 1943, the inexperienced American II Corps was mauled by Rommel in Tunisia. It was a humiliation. The American soldiers were routed, fleeing in panic. Discipline collapsed. Eisenhower looked at the disaster and knew he had only one card to play. He didn't need a diplomat. He needed a disciplinarian. He fired the commander, Lloyd Fredendall, and sent for Patton. This moment defined the utility of the leash. Eisenhower unleashed Patton on the demoralized II Corps with a specific mandate. Fix it. And Patton did. He descended on the troops like a vengeful god. He fined them for unpolished boots. He screamed. He postured. He made them hate him. But in doing so, he made them soldiers. Within weeks, the II Corps was winning battles. Eisenhower was relieved, but he was also wary. He saw that Patton's success was fueled by a chaotic energy that was hard to direct. As the North African campaign concluded and eyes turned toward Sicily, Eisenhower faced his first great dilemma regarding his old friend. Patton had saved the army in Tunisia. He was a hero in the American press. But Eisenhower was receiving reports of Patton's erratic behavior, his obsession with besting the British General Bernard Montgomery, and his disdain for the rules of coalition warfare. Eisenhower wrote to General Marshall, admitting that Patton was a problem child. He was grappling with the central paradox. How you keep a man who believes he is Achilles functioning within a modern, corporate military structure? The plan for the invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky, would bring this tension to a boiling point. Eisenhower, acting as the referee between the American Patton and the British Montgomery, would try to harness Patton's aggression while keeping him subordinate to the overall strategic plan. It was a gamble. Eisenhower hoped that Patton's desire for glory would motivate him to move fast, but he feared that same desire would cause him to go rogue. As the ships gathered in the Mediterranean in July 1943, Eisenhower tightened the leash, giving the primary role to Montgomery and relegating Patton to a supporting flank protection mission. He hoped this would keep Patton out of trouble. He was wrong. Patton did not do supporting roles. As the landing craft hit the beaches of Sicily, the problem child was about to break the furniture. The race for Palermo was about to begin, and with it, the chain of events that would force Eisenhower to make the hardest decision of his career regarding his oldest military friend. July 1943. The invasion of Sicily is underway. On the maps in London and Washington, the plan is neat and orderly. General Montgomery's 8th Army is the sword, driving up the east coast of Messina to cut off the German retreat. General Patton's 7th Army is the shield, protecting Montgomery's left flank. It is a sensible conservative plan designed by committee, but on the ground, in the scorching heat of the Mediterranean summer, the plan is disintegrating because George Patton refuses to be a shield. He is a man who craves the offensive. He looks at the open road to the west, toward the glittering prize of Palermo, and he sees an opportunity that the planners missed. Without explicit permission, Patton unleashed his armored columns. He turned the 7th Army into a runaway train. They swept across western Sicily with a speed that stunned the Germans and Italians. In just a few days, Patton captured Palermo. It was a masterstroke of morale, a headline-grabbing victory that thrilled the American public. But back in Algiers, Dwight Eisenhower was rubbing his temples. Patton was winning, yes, but he was doing it by effectively rewriting the Allied strategy on the fly. He was proving that he could not be controlled. And as Patton turned his eyes east, engaging in a petty ego-driven race with Montgomery to reach Messina first. The cracks in his temperament were widening under the pressure. If you enjoy historical breakdowns that focus on the decision-making processes of high command, please consider subscribing. We delve into the why and how of history, beyond just the dates and battles. The Leash was already fraying when the incidents occurred that would nearly sever it completely. The story is well known, but its impact on the Eisenhower-Patton relationship is often misunderstood. In early August 1943, on 2 separate occasions, General Patton visited field hospitals. He was there to comfort the wounded, a role he took seriously. But when he encountered soldiers suffering from combat stress reaction, men with no visible physical wounds, his worldview collapsed. To a man who believed in the ancient warrior code, battle fatigue was simply a euphemism for cowardice. He slapped Private Charles Cole. A week later, he slapped and threatened to shoot Private Paul Bennett. These were not just outbursts, they were court-martial offenses. Striking an enlisted man is one of the gravest sins an officer can commit. When the reports reached Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander was faced with a political nightmare. The story was radioactive. If it leaked to the press, the American mothers who had sent their sons to war would demand Patton's head. The pressure to fire him was immense. Many of Eisenhower's staff urged him to send Patton home in disgrace. General Omar Bradley, Patton's subordinate at the time, was disgusted. This is where we see the genius and the ruthlessness of Eisenhower's management. A lesser manager would have fired Patton to save face. A weaker manager would have buried the report and done nothing. Eisenhower did neither. He executed a complex maneuver to save the asset while punishing the man. He wrote Patton a private, scorching letter. He didn't order a court-martial, but he ordered Patton to apologize, personally, to the soldiers, the medical staff, and to every single division under his command. It was a humiliation ritual. For a man of Patton's ego, standing on a soapbox in front of thousands of troops to apologize for his own excess of zeal was a punishment worse than death. But Eisenhower went further. He put Patton in the doghouse. When the planning began for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, everyone assumed Patton would lead it. He was the most experienced combat commander. He was the face of American victory. But Eisenhower passed him over. He selected Omar Bradley, the quiet, steady, reliable GI's general, to lead the U.S. First Army onto the beaches. Patton was left in Sicily, commanding nothing but a desk. He was stripped of his 7th Army. He was left to stew in his own misery, convinced that his career was over. Why did Eisenhower save him? Why go through the trouble of the apologies and the cover-up until Drew Pearson broke the story later in November? Because Eisenhower looked at the map of Fortress Europe. He saw the Atlantic Wall. He saw the Panzer divisions massing in France. He knew that breaking into Europe would be the hardest military operation in history. And he knew that once the breach was made, he would need a closer. He needed a general who could drive a tank army through a brick wall and keep going until the fuel ran out. Bradley could break the door down, but only Patton could chase the enemy into the house and burn it down. Eisenhower famously likened Patton to a fire hose. If you don't hold on to it tight, it will whip around and break your windows. But if you aim it at the fire, it's the only thing that will save you. Eisenhower decided to keep the fire hose in the closet, coiled and waiting, until the house was truly burning. For months, Patton lived in a state of paranoid despair. He wrote to his wife that Ike has forgotten me. He believed that the British were conspiring against him. He felt useless. But Eisenhower was using him even in exile. This was the beginning of the Great Deception. Eisenhower realized that the Germans respected Patton more than any other Allied general. German intelligence could not believe that the Americans would sideline their best warrior for a slap. They assumed Patton must be preparing for the real invasion. So Eisenhower kept Patton visible but unemployed. He let the Germans wonder where he was. He was turning Patton into a weapon of psychological warfare. The leash was now being used to jerk the German high command around. Patton was sent to Cairo. He was sent to Corsica. Every time he moved, German divisions moved to counter him. The ghost general was tying down enemy forces without firing a shot. By January 1944, Eisenhower summoned Patton to London. The exile was effectively over, but the terms had changed. Patton was given command of the Third Army, but he was told, in no uncertain terms, that this was his last chance. One more slip-up, one more slap, one more political speech, and he would be on a plane to Washington before he could blink. Eisenhower looked his old friend in the eye and told him that he was now subordinate to Omar Bradley, the man who used to be Patton's subordinate. It was a bitter pill to swallow. Patton accepted. He had no choice. He wanted to fight more than he wanted his pride. But as the date of D-Day approached, the leash remained short. Patton would not be landing on June 6. He would be sitting in England, waiting for the call, while other men died on the beaches. Eisenhower was saving his problem child for the war movement he hoped would follow, but he was terrified that Patton would blow it before the first tank ever rolled off a landing craft. And as we will see, Eisenhower's fears were entirely justified. Spring 1944. The mist-shrouded fields of southeastern England are transforming into the greatest military staging ground in history. Every hedgerow hides a tank. Every harbor is choked with landing craft. The Allies are coiled, ready to strike at the heart of Hitler's fortress Europe. In London, General Dwight Eisenhower sits at the center of a spiderweb of intelligence, logistics, and terrifying responsibility. He knows that the invasion of Normandy, Operation Overlord, is a gamble of epic proportions. To succeed, he needs two things: total secrecy regarding the landing site, and a commander who can instill terror in the German High Command. He has the plan for the first. And in George Patton, he has the instrument for the second. But this time, Eisenhower is using the leash in a way that is utterly counterintuitive. He is not holding Patton back to keep him safe. He is holding him back to make him conspicuous. Eisenhower assigns Patton to command the 1st United States Army Group, or FUSAG. It sounds like a mighty juggernaut, a force capable of crushing the Wehrmacht. In reality, FUSAG is a phantom. It is a ghost army. Its tanks are made of inflated rubber. Its aircraft are made of plywood and canvas. Its radio traffic is a script read by actors. FUSAG is the centerpiece of Operation Fortitude, the massive deception campaign designed to convince Adolf Hitler that the invasion will come not at Normandy, but at the Pas de Calais, the shortest route across the Channel. If you are fascinated by the intersection of military strategy and psychological warfare, and how deception operations like Fortitude shape the outcome of the war, please subscribe to our channel. We explore these hidden layers of history in depth. Eisenhower knew that the Germans studied Allied personnel movements like hawks. He knew they considered Patton to be the Allied equivalent of Rommel, a master of mobility and the only general capable of leading the initial assault. So, Eisenhower placed Patton prominently in Dover, directly across from Calais. He let Patton be seen. He let the spies report that Old Blood and Guts was pacing the cliffs of Dover, looking hungrily at the French coast. The ruse worked brilliantly. The German 15th Army, their most powerful reserve force, was pinned down in the Pas de Calais, waiting for an attack led by Patton that would never come. For Eisenhower, this was a masterful use of a troubled asset. He was leveraging Patton's reputation, while keeping Patton himself far away from the delicate planning of the real invasion. But for Patton, it was agony. He was a man of action, trapped in a theater production. He paced his headquarters in Knutsford, consuming vast amounts of history books, polishing his boots, and stewing in a toxic brew of jealousy and boredom. He watched as his former subordinate, Omar Bradley, was given command of the actual ground forces for D-Day. He watched as Montgomery, his arch-rival, was given overall command of the ground campaign. Patton felt like a racehorse locked in a stable, while the donkeys were being lined up at the starting gate. And as Eisenhower knew all too well, a bored Patton was a dangerous Patton. On April 25, 1944, just weeks before the invasion, the leash snapped again. Patton attended the opening of a welcome club for American soldiers in the town of Knutsford. It was supposed to be a low-key local event. There were no official press corps invited. Patton, feeling relaxed and perhaps a bit loose, gave a short, improvised speech. He spoke about the camaraderie between the soldiers, and then he dropped the geopolitical grenade. He said, "It is the evident destiny of the British and the Americans to rule the world, and the better we know each other, the better job we will do. He omitted the Russians. In 1944, the Soviet Union was a vital, if difficult, ally. The Red Army was doing the bulk of the dying on the Eastern Front. To suggest that the Anglo-Americans would rule the post-war world alone was to insult Stalin and threaten the fragile alliance that Eisenhower spent every waking hour trying to hold together. The press got hold of the quote. The headline screamed, "Patton slights Russia." The scandal was instant and global. Eisenhower was, in his own words, just about fed up. He had saved Patton after the slapping incidents. He had given him a second chance. He had designed a whole deception operation around him. And now, on the eve of the most critical moment in the war, Patton had once again opened his mouth and created a political crisis. Eisenhower's patience, legendary for its depth, hit rock bottom. He sat down at his desk and wrote a letter to General George Marshall in Washington. In it, he laid out the case for relieving Patton of command. He argued that Patton's inability to control his tongue outweighed his tactical brilliance. He was ready to send him home. The leash was in his hand, and he was ready to let go. Marshall, however, sent a wise and cryptic reply. He told Eisenhower that the decision was his alone, but he added a crucial caveat. You have a lot of hard fighting ahead. It was a subtle reminder. The invasion was just the first step. Once the Allies were ashore, they would need to break out. They would need to maneuver. Marshall was essentially asking Eisenhower, "Are you sure you want to fight the Germans without your best fighter?" Eisenhower hesitated. He looked at the roster of his generals. He had Bradley, who was steady. He had Hodges, who was competent. He had Clark, who was ambitious. But he didn't have another Patton. He didn't have anyone else who could sense a weakness in the enemy line and exploit it with such terrifying speed. Eisenhower made the cold, pragmatic calculation that defined his leadership. He decided that the political headache of keeping Patton was less dangerous than the military risk of losing him. He summoned Patton to his headquarters. Patton expected to be fired. He was emotional, almost tearful, pleading to be allowed to stay even as a common rifleman. Eisenhower, stern and unyielding, dressed him down like a schoolboy. He told Patton that this was absolutely the final warning. He was to keep his mouth shut. He was to stay invisible. He was to play the part of the decoy, and nothing else until told otherwise. So, as June 6, 1944 dawned and the Great Armada sailed for Normandy, George Patton sat in his room in England. He was not leading the charge. He was not riding into history on the first wave. He was sitting on the bench, a ghost general commanding a fake army, listening to the radio reports of other men fighting his war. Eisenhower had successfully kept him on the leash, protecting the invasion from Patton's chaotic energy. But Eisenhower also knew that the stalemate in the hedgerows was coming. He knew that sooner or later, the broad front would get stuck. And when that happened, he would need to unleash the lion he had worked so hard to tame. July 1944. The Normandy campaign has devolved into a nightmare. The hedgerow hell of the Bocage country has neutralized the Allied advantage in mobility. American tanks are forced to crawl down sunken lanes, ambushed at point-blank range by hidden German anti-tank guns. The casualty rates are appalling, rivaling the worst days of the First World War. General Omar Bradley is inching forward, but Eisenhower knows that attrition is a losing game. The Allied public is getting restless. The Soviets are watching. Eisenhower needs to break the deadlock. He needs to inject chaos into the German lines. It is finally time to unlock the closet. On August 1st, 1944, the Phantom Fusag is forgotten, and the 3rd United States Army becomes operational. George Patton is officially off the leash. What followed was the most spectacular display of mechanized warfare in American history. While Bradley's First Army punched a hole near St. Lo in Operation Cobra, it was Patton's Third Army that drove through it and fanned out like a wildfire. Eisenhower watched from his headquarters, equal parts thrilled and terrified. He had unleashed a fire hose. It was thrashing wildly across France. Patton didn't just advance. He raced. He ordered his commanders to bypass resistance, to throw away the rule books on flank security, and to haul ass toward the Seine. If you want to understand the logistical backbone that makes such rapid advances possible and why they eventually fail, please subscribe to the channel. We break down the boring stuff that actually decide the outcome of wars. For a brief, intoxicating month in August 1944, the dynamic between Eisenhower and Patton seemed to work perfectly. Eisenhower, the distant strategist, pointed to the map, and Patton, the operational artist, painted it American olive drab. The Third Army liberated Brittany, swung east, and began encircling the German 7th Army. But even in victory, the friction remained. The first major tug on the Leash occurred at the Falaise Pocket. Patton's forces had raced north to Argenton, forming the southern jaw of a massive trap. The British and Canadians were pushing south from Falaise. Inside the gap were 100,000 German soldiers. Patton begged to close the trap. He radioed Bradley, "Let me go. I have a telephone cable around their necks." But Bradley, with Eisenhower's tacit approval, ordered Patton to halt. They feared a chaotic collision between converging Allied armies. They adhered to the rigid boundary lines drawn on the planning maps. Patton was furious. He believed that the caution of the High Command was allowing the enemy to escape. He saw it as a lack of killer instinct in Eisenhower's headquarters. Eisenhower saw it as necessary control in a chaotic theater. Thousands of Germans escaped to fight another day, a fact that Patton would never let Eisenhower forget. But the real crisis, the moment that would define the Leash for the rest of the war, was not about tactics. It was about gasoline. By late August, the Allied armies were racing toward the German border. The German army in the west was broken, fleeing in disarray. Patton was convinced that he could drive straight across the Rhine and end the war by Christmas. He proposed a single-thrust strategy: give all the available fuel to the Third Army, halt everyone else, and let him spearhead a knife thrust into the heart of the Reich. Eisenhower said no. This decision is the most controversial of Eisenhower's command. To Patton, it was madness. It was sabotage. He believed that Eisenhower was playing politics, deliberately slowing down the Americans to allow Montgomery and the British to catch up and share the glory. Patton raged in his diary, calling Eisenhower's staff fools and cowards. But Eisenhower was looking at a different map than Patton. He was looking at the broad front. Eisenhower's strategy was to advance all armies simultaneously: Montgomery in the north, Bradley in the center, Devers in the south. This would stretch the German defenses until they snapped and ensure that no single Allied army could be cut off and destroyed. It was a low-risk, methodical approach. It was a strategy of a man managing a corporate merger, not a gambler playing poker. Eisenhower knew that a single thrust by Patton was high risk. If Patton ran out of gas deep in Germany, he could be surrounded and annihilated. Eisenhower was not willing to gamble the alliance on one roll of the dice. So the order went out. The supplies were split. And because the ports of Normandy were hundreds of miles behind the front, there wasn't enough gas for everyone. On August 31st, the Third Army's tanks sputtered to a halt near the Moselle River. They were barely 60 miles from the German border. The engines went silent. Patton was paralyzed. He sent officers to hijack fuel trucks from other units. He pleaded with Bradley, but the decision had been made. Eisenhower kept the leash tight. He prioritized Montgomery's Operation Market Garden in the north, a failed gamble to cross the Rhine, over Patton's drive in the south. During the critical month of September, while Patton sat immobile, the Germans regrouped. They dug in. They fortified the Siegfried Line. The General Mud arrived. The window of opportunity for a quick victory slammed shut. Patton blamed Eisenhower personally for the extension of the war. He believed that the Supreme Commander's obsession with coalition harmony, keeping the British happy by giving them supplies, had cost American lives. Eisenhower, for his part, tolerated Patton's insubordination because he knew he would need him again. He knew the easy days were over. The war movement had ended. The war of attrition had begun. And in a war of attrition, you don't need a racehorse. You need a bulldog. As the leaves fell and the snow began to gather in the Ardennes, Eisenhower's broad front strategy seemed to have secured victory, albeit slowly. The Allies were lined up along the German border. The enemy was assumed to be finished. Eisenhower relaxed the leash, allowing Patton to engage in a bloody, grinding offensive around Metz. But neither of them knew that the leash was about to be yanked harder than ever, not by Allied logistics, but by a desperate gamble from Adolf Hitler. The relationship between the steady Kansan and the volatile Californian was about to face its ultimate test in the snow. December 16, 1944, the Ardennes Forest. It was known as the Ghost Front, a quiet sector of snow-covered pine trees and rolling hills where exhausted American divisions were sent to rest and green units were sent to learn the ropes. Allied intelligence was confident that the German army was a spent force, incapable of mounting a major offensive. The war was effectively considered won. The only question was a timeline. In the mess halls and headquarters across Belgium and France, the talk was of Christmas turkeys and the final drive to Berlin in the spring. Dwight Eisenhower was even celebrating his promotion to the new 5-star rank of General of the Army. But in the pre-dawn mist, the illusion of safety was shattered by the roar of 1,000 German guns. Operation Walk am Rhein had begun. Hitler had scraped together his last reserves, the 6th Panzer Army, the 5th Panzer Army, the elite SS divisions, and hurled them at the weakest point in the Allied line. The sheer violence of the assault broke the American front. Panic spread like a virus. Units were overrun, communications were cut, and a massive bulge began to form in the Allied lines, threatening to split the British and American armies and capture the vital port of Antwerp. If you want to understand the difference between strategy and operations, and how a single decision in a conference room can save an entire army, please subscribe. We break down the pivotal moments where history held its breath. In Versailles, the mood at SHAF headquarters was grim. Reports of SS massacres and American surrenders were pouring in. But Dwight Eisenhower did not panic. This was his finest hour as a Supreme Commander. While others saw disaster, Eisenhower saw opportunity. He realized that by coming out of their fortifications, the Germans had exposed themselves. He famously told his staff, "The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not a disaster. There will be only cheerful faces at this table." But to exploit this opportunity, he needed a miracle. He needed a force that could stop its current attack, turn 90 degrees on a dime, and march north into the teeth of a blizzard to hit the German flank. There was only one man in the European theater capable of such a feat. Eisenhower knew it. The leash he had held so tightly was about to be dropped completely. On December 19th, Eisenhower summoned his senior commanders to a damp, cold barracks in Verdun. The room was filled with cigarette smoke and tension. Bradley was there. Devers was there. Patton was there. Eisenhower stood before a large map and outlined the crisis. He then turned to Patton. The Third Army was currently engaged in heavy fighting in the Saar region to the south. Eisenhower asked Patton how long it would take him to disengage, pivot his army, and launch a counterattack toward the besieged town of Bastogne. The other generals expected Patton to say for days, perhaps a week. Moving an army of hundreds of thousands of men and vehicles in winter conditions is a logistical nightmare. It usually takes days just to print the maps. Patton looked at Eisenhower and said, "I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The room went silent. Some of the British officers chuckled nervously. It sounded like typical Patton bluster, the boast of a madman. But Eisenhower looked at his old friend. He knew Patton better than anyone. He knew that Patton had foreseen this attack. He knew that Patton had already ordered his staff to draw up 3 separate contingency plans for a turn to the north. While the other generals were driving to the meeting, Patton's signal corps was already nailing up Third Army signposts on the icy roads leading to Bastogne. Eisenhower didn't laugh. He nodded. He said, "Execute." What followed was the greatest logistical maneuver of the war. In a blinding snowstorm, Patton moved 133,000 vehicles and troops over 100 miles of single-track, icy roads. He did it without lights. He did it without radio traffic. It was a symphony of movement conducted by a man who was often dismissed as a brute. This was why Eisenhower had kept him. This was why he had tolerated the slaps, the insults, and the political headaches. For this singular moment of operational genius. But even the genius needed help. The weather was atrocious. Allied air power, the trump card of the U.S. Army, was grounded by thick fog. Patton, in a moment that perfectly encapsulates his medieval mindset, summoned his chaplain. He ordered him to write a prayer for weather. He demanded that God clear the skies so his tanks could kill Germans. The prayer was typed up and distributed to every soldier in the Third Army. And on December 23rd, the skies cleared. The Thunderbolt fighter bombers roared down on the German columns. Patton's 4th Armored Division smashed into the German southern flank. On the day after Christmas, the lead American tank broke through the German lines and linked up with the 101st Airborne Defenders in Bastogne. The bulge was punctured. The German offensive was doomed. Patton was the hero of the hour. The press loved him. The troops loved him. Eisenhower sent him a message of warm congratulations. But the moment the crisis passed, the Leash reappeared. With the Germans halted, the question became how to destroy them. Patton proposed a big solution. He wanted to drive deep into the base of the bulge, cutting off the German retreat at the neck and trapping the entire Panzer Army. It was aggressive. It was risky. It promised total annihilation of the enemy. Eisenhower and Bradley, reverting to their cautious broad front mentality, chose the small solution. They ordered Patton to push slowly from the south, while Montgomery pushed from the north, squeezing the Germans out of bulge like toothpaste. Patton was apoplectic. He argued that this would allow the Germans to escape to the Siegfried Line. He was right. The slow squeeze allowed tens of thousands of German soldiers and vehicles to withdraw and fight for another 3 months. Eisenhower's decision here highlights the fundamental difference between the two men. Patton wanted to win the war today, regardless of the risk. Eisenhower wanted to win the war surely, without risking a catastrophic reversal that could fracture the alliance. He trusted Patton to save the army, but he did not trust him to finish the war on his own terms. As 1945 dawned, the Third Army resumed its drive. They crossed the Rhine in a spectacular night operation, Patton famously urinating in the river to mock Montgomery's elaborate preparations downstream. They tore into the German heartland. But as the Third Army raced toward the Czech border and the city of Berlin appeared on the horizon, the geopolitical reality of the post-war world began to intrude. Eisenhower was no longer just a general. He was a statesman managing the peace. And Patton, with his hatred of the Soviets and his loose tongue, was about to become a liability once again. The war of bullets was ending. The war of politics was beginning. And in this new war, there was no place for a gladiator. Eisenhower was about to make the final tug on the leash, one that would silence the lion for good. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe. The guns that had thundered for 6 years finally fell silent. For Dwight Eisenhower, V-Day was a culmination of a colossal diplomatic and military effort. He had held the fractious alliance together, balanced the egos of Montgomery and de Gaulle, and crushed the Nazi regime. Now his job description changed instantly. He was no longer just a supreme commander. He was a de facto ruler of occupied Germany. His new mission was not to destroy, but to rebuild and to cleanse. The policy was denazification, the total removal of Nazi party members from all positions of influence in German society. It was a moral imperative for the Allies. But for George Patton, peace was not a relief, it was a prison. He famously declared, "Peace is going to be hell on me." He was appointed the military governor of Bavaria, tasked with administering the ruins of Munich and the surrounding countryside. And it was here in the rubble of the Third Reich that the leash finally snapped. Eisenhower had successfully managed Patton the warrior, but he found it impossible to manage Patton the governor. The conflict began almost immediately. Patton looked at the destroyed infrastructure of Bavaria, the bombed-out sewers, the broken power grids, the starving population, and he applied his usual ruthless pragmatism. He needed the trains to run. He needed the banks to open. And the only people with the technical expertise to do those jobs were the people who had held him under Hitler. To Patton, the denazification order was a bureaucratic obstacle to efficiency. He began to ignore Eisenhower's direct orders. He kept former Nazi party members in key administrative posts, arguing that he couldn't run a province with inexperienced amateurs. Reports began to filter back to Eisenhower's headquarters in Frankfurt. The Supreme Commander was alarmed. He wrote to Patton, warning him that the removal of Nazis was not optional. It was the primary war aim of the United States. He explained that this was a political and moral necessity, not a military one. But Patton didn't listen. He viewed the SS as a criminal element, but the average party member as simply a conscript of the system. He was viewing the defeated enemy through the lens of 19th century chivalry, while the world was reeling from the 20th century horror of the Holocaust. The tension reached its breaking point on September 22, 1945. Patton held a press conference. Reporters, sensing his frustration and his unfiltered nature, pressed him on why he was retaining Nazis in government jobs. Patton, agitated and dismissive, tried to explain that membership in the Nazi Party was often just a requirement for employment. He then uttered the sentence that would end his career. He said, "The Nazi thing is just like a Democrat and Republican election." The comment was a public relations nuclear explosion. To compare the perpetrators of the final solution and the architects of aggressive war to American political parties was an insult so profound it made headlines around the globe. In Washington, the reaction was furious. In London, it was disbelief. Eisenhower, who had protected Patton from the slapping incidents, who had saved him from the Knutsford scandal, and who had given him the Third Army, finally realized there was no saving him this time. The war was over. The utility of the mad dog was gone. The world needed diplomats, and Patton had just proven he was dangerously incapable of diplomacy. On September 29th, Eisenhower summoned Patton to Frankfurt. It was a somber meeting between two men who had been friends for nearly 30 years. There was no shouting. Eisenhower simply relieved Patton of command of the Third Army, the beloved force he had led across France. He was transferred to the command of the 15th Army, a paper army consisting of a handful of historians and clerks tasked with writing a study of the war. It was a humiliating demotion. It was exile. Patton was devastated. He felt betrayed by the friend he had served so loyally. He sank into a deep depression, writing to his wife that he felt like a package that has been wrapped up and put on the shelf. He spoke openly of resigning his commission and going on a speaking tour to warn the American people about the Soviet threat. Another political landmine Eisenhower was desperate to avoid. But the final chapter of their relationship would not be written in a memoir or speech. It would be written on a lonely road near Mannheim. On December 9, 1945, the day before he was scheduled to fly home to the United States, perhaps to start a political firestorm, Patton went pheasant hunting. His Cadillac staff car collided at low speed with an army truck. It was a minor accident. The driver and the other passenger were unhurt, but Patton was thrown forward, striking his head on the glass partition. He was paralyzed from the neck down. He lingered for 12 days in a hospital in Heidelberg. Eisenhower visited him, but the old warmth was gone, replaced by a tragic sadness. On December 21, 1945, General George S. Patton Jr. died in his sleep. He was buried in Luxembourg, alongside the men of his Third Army who had died in the Battle of the Bulge. With Patton's death, the problem was solved, but the legacy of the relationship remained. Historians have debated for decades whether Eisenhower held Patton back too much or not enough. But the record shows a masterful balancing act. Eisenhower understood that Patton was a unique weapon, a diamond with a sharp cutting edge but flaw that ran through center. A lesser commander would have discarded Patton in 1943 and lost the war's greatest tactical instrument. A reckless commander would have given Patton supreme command and risked the collapse of the alliance. Eisenhower's genius was in the leash itself. He knew exactly when to tighten it to prevent disaster, and exactly when to let it go to achieve victory. He kept Patton on a leash not because he didn't trust his ability to fight, but because he didn't trust his ability to stop. And in the end, that is the burden of the Supreme Commander, to know the difference between the man who can win the battle and the man who can win the peace.